Hello, welcome to Consider the Source Conversations. I'm Jennifer Rhodes, and I'm so thrilled to be joined today by both our creative members of the team for the upcoming world premiere, The Lord of Cries, composer John Corigliano and composer librettist Mark Adamo. Thank you both so much for being here.
Great. Delighted to be here.
You both have an incredible range of narrative sources across your bodies of work, from Aristophanes to Alcott, from Bob Dylan to Beaumarchais. Do you recall early experiences that first sparked your imagination regarding the potential of narrative and music and their symbiosis?
Well, I fell in love with Dylan Thomas's work when I was in college. And I was so in love with it, I actually wrote the first piece I wrote getting out of college was a setting of his Fern Hill, about his summer in the farm Fern Hill. And I wrote it for my high school music teacher, who encouraged me to be a composer. Nobody else did, but she did. And so I was very grateful, and she remained a friend through the rest of our lives together. And I wrote that for her and loved the idea of a young Dylan Thomas in this beautiful farm. And later on, when the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center opened in, I think, 1970 or 71, they asked me to write a piece for voice and all their instruments, with 7 instruments. And again, I looked to Dylan Thomas, and I found an extraordinary poem, Poem in October, which celebrated his 30th birthday. If you know the life of Dylan Thomas, it's unfortunate that shortly after that he descended into alcoholism. But really at that time, he was just joyous, and it was October, and he described it in this gorgeous way. And I wrote it for tenor and these chamber groups. And later on, because I was almost at the same ages as Dylan Thomas was when he composed the poems, when he was 35, he had become an alcoholic. His life was not what it would be. He only lived a few more years after that. And he wrote a very long and great poem on his birthday. This one, his 35th birthday, but he didn't celebrate it. He walked by the ocean, in Swansea, right by the water, and he wrote this enormous poem about death. And at the very end of this long poem, he's always saying he. And all of a sudden he says, I. And he says, I mourn for my loss and all this, but I have one thing left. And he said, the closer I move to death, the louder the sun blooms. And then this radiantly beautiful idea of his death not being his death so much as his moving on in this transition world to something beautiful. And it was so moving that I asked Paul Calloway of the Washington National Cathedral to commission me to put 3 of the pieces together and make a trilogy. And then that was done in Washington Cathedral. And I had the feeling it wasn't complete because it needed to binding matter. The first piece has a boy soprano in the solo with chorus, and that's his youth. And the 30th birthday is tenor. And of course, the 35th birthday is baritone. But I wanted the baritone to tell the story up front. And I really had no way to do that because he had just so many works, and I looked through them all and they weren't connective. And then I happened to look at the preface that he wrote. And, it says preface. So one would think it's simply him describing what he's done and what he's doing. Instead, it was a giant poem in 2 parts. And the first part introduced the first section of the piece. And the last thing was introduced by the second part. It absolutely was perfect because it told his story in the most gorgeous poetry. And that became the whole Dylan Thomas trilogy, starting with the baritone and then referring back to his youth in Fern Hill, and then referring to his 30th birthday, and then a pause, and then this big thing with baritone, chorus, and orchestra at the end about his death. So very often these reference points and all of this sort of stuff comes on the way as you live. I didn't know the last poem when I wrote the first poem and all of that. And I always set people who have these verbal, almost musical imagery in their work, whether it's Richard Wilbur, who was so kind to me when I met with him, and Stephen Spencer, and my great collaborator, William M. Hoffman on The Ghosts of Versailles, who, we were friends all our lives, so it was natural that we worked together. And all of those things led to my writing the pieces I wrote. The Ghosts of Versailles, because Bill and I so loved the idea of the past and the present coinciding, and what it was like to be in the world of Marie Antoinette, and what it was like to be kind of a ghost in the present looking at that world. We wrote that opera. And then I wrote a song cycle of the 10th anniversary, actually, of 9/11, which actually had the poems by Miloš, Homer, Lipo, and Yip Harburg, unlikely bunch, but I put them together called One Sweet Morning. And again, it's a travel, it's a journey. And I think that's a beautiful part of living, is you absorb these things and then you use them in your work.
I have a quick question. Who was the first voice soprano when it was changed from mezzo soprano to?
That's funny. What happens, it wasn't the first one. It was the one that Leonard Slatkin did, the first real.
Well, the first one in which it was a voice soprano rather than a mezzo.
Yes. And the trouble with voice sopranos is that when they get in front of an orchestra and a chorus in the first rehearsal, suddenly their voices change. And they're singing up high, and suddenly it drops down, and you say, uh-oh, got to find another voice soprano. And so that happened to us in the National Symphony in Washington. And we didn't know what to do because we didn't have another voice soprano. And we were asking around, and there was this young man. What was his name again?
Anthony something.
Anthony Rolf Costanza.
At like 13.
At 13 or so.
Already a fully formed performer. Stepped off the plane, knew it cold.
He was the pro.
It's the first time we met. We've known each other like 20-something years.
Yeah. He sang that as a boy soprano. And it was great. We became friends immediately. He was the pro of pros. I mean, he just knew exactly what to do.
I mean, great musician, poet, but I mean, just amazing. Utterly formed.
So we've been friends, and I've always wanted to write for him. And of course, we now have the chance to write a piece which he is featured as I think, a great role for countertenor. I mean, I'm really thrilled with this, and he is too, because, aside from the Baroque pieces, there aren't many pieces for countertenor. And in the 20th, 21st century, composers are realizing how marvelous those voices are in the right setting. And I think this is the right setting. Anyway, I've talked too much.
No, it's fine. I mean, if the question is when I first began to discover that music and narrative could ignite each other, I think really the earliest and most honest question was the first time I ever went to the 12 o'clock Mass as opposed to the 9:30 or the 10:45 in Willingboro, New Jersey, because the 12 o'clock Mass was the only Mass in which the choir sang. And we generally went to the early Masses, but for reasons of the plot, one day the only Mass we could go to was the noon Mass, and I did not know that was happening. And of course, a church service is a narrative of sorts, and then all of a sudden, when the choir, which was in the back of the church, suddenly comes in with the Gloria, it really did seem, it was that moment when the heavens opened. And in interviews, sometimes I have been asked a question like this, and I will say I never quite know whether I was drawn to the musical theater in religion or the religiosity of musical theater, because there is a way in which, what's the it's not a cliche exactly, but the saying is just that to sing is to pray twice. I mean, there is something about the application of the singing voice to whatever narrative it is that just kind of amplifies, it goes deeper and higher at the same time. But I actually wasn't thinking of myself as a musician early on, simply because I didn't have a piano. I was thinking of myself as a playwright. And more, though, I was drawn to A, musical theater rather than simply spoken theater, and B, the sort of musical theater that was adjacent to opera, although I wasn't thinking of it in those terms. So it was the Sondheim of Sweeney Todd more than, say, the Sondheim of Company, or the Bernstein of Candide rather than the Bernstein of On the Town, Porgy and Bess as Porgy and Bess. But the more I started to listen to that music, and the more I started listening to the composers who influenced those composers. So it was sort of backwards from Bernstein and Sondheim into Stravinsky or to Strauss, and before I knew it, I was sort of watching opera, not entirely getting it, because it was I didn't understand enough of it to appreciate the Germanness or the 19th centuryness of any given piece. That came later. But then it was on television in these days when I saw Elektra with Birgit Nielsen, or Dialogues of the Carmelites with Jesse Norman, or I think live, actually, by accident, the Saint of Bleecker Street in Washington, actually. And we disagree. He thinks the whole thing is a masterpiece. I think the first act is a masterpiece, and then it has troubles.
It's a masterpiece.
Yeah, all right, well, to be continued. But yeah, so it kind of, it was there was a sense in which what we do now kind of found me more than I went looking for it. It really started in those early unexpected collisions of music and liturgy, and then it was from theater to musical theater to opera that one traced one's path.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I mean, I think too, in this unusual, painful year, to have lost the theaters, this sort of sacred space of communion, and to be able to return with Dionysus on stage is just endlessly exciting to think about what that moment is gonna feel like.
Well, I didn't before this moment, but there's a weird overlap because the show is really, in a certain way, about different kinds of religion. I mean, the religiosity of a somewhat constrained and traditional and not entirely honest form of traditional faith, and something that's a lot less comforting, but is a bit truer about human nature. It's really the fulcrum of this narrative.
Yeah. On the subject of opera, what do you find that opera as a medium does especially well? Suitable ideas or operatic moments that kind of encapsulate what you think of as opera doing particularly well?
Well, there are two things for me. One is the world of surrealism. The idea of being in a place, but it's not in a place, and the idea of the music and the happenings on stage can take you into a world only of imagination that doesn't exist. The first of the great pieces of that, as far as I'm concerned, is the Ravel, L'Enfant et le Sortilège, which is, this child left alone by his mother, and all the things that he's kicked around and made messes of, the teapot and also all sorts of things, gang up on him and say, enough of that. And the wild fantasy and the way Ravel does it, I mean, it's just otherworldly to me. I just love that world. And part of the things I look for, the idea of surrealism, is very much in the world of the ghosts, which are not real, but they're not real, and all of that. And in this opera, the idea of Dionysus, of many forms, who appears in many ways and changes all the time. As far as the other thing is passion, is the idea of primal feeling, because singing and the orchestra can get you into that state. And I think we have some real primal moments in our opera, and I love that. I can, again, Menotti, I can talk about the Consul and the great aria, Papers, that is sung as this woman is constantly frustrated by the Consul, not being able to see the Consul just because of the mechanics of the world. And finally, it's just primal. She explodes. And it's one of the great moments of theater. And it just couldn't happen any other way but in an opera. So, I mean, those things are the two things that I really think opera does better than anything.
I would echo that. I think I tend to think of opera as live cinema. There isn't really any performing art form that folds in as many other art forms. I think there's a reason that opera is a plural noun, because it's acting and it's singing and it's symphonism and it's spectacle. And it is, there's a kind of, I always wince a little bit at the term heightened emotion, because I think of Martha Graham's quote that the challenge of art is not to be larger than life, but to be as large. And to me, the best opera actually doesn't make you feel like somehow the composer or the performer are exaggerating what the feeling or the experience is, but they're simply finding, the deepest core of it and then projecting it through voice or orchestra or word or any of that. But there's a way in which music can act the way the camera can in film. Music can give you long shot, can give you close up. There's a, without being cinematic in the sense of resembling a film score, music is really telling the story. It's co-narrating the story. It's not simply accompanying something that could very well be a spoken play, which, among other things, this man on my right has done brilliantly, because if you look at something like They Are Always With Me, which is the opening monologue of the Marie Antoinette house in The Ghost of Versailles, which is simultaneously this utterly private, personal monologue of this woman reliving her trauma, and yet in the course of it, just the music itself is bringing in the cinematic picture of that. No matter how you stage it, the music itself makes oral both the close-up and the long shot, if you will, of characterization. And there isn't really another form, I think, that does that the way that opera does. There are other pieces. The end of Peter Grimes does this. Certainly, the long shot, spiraling moment of all time is the finale of Rosenkavalier, where you just feel like you are lifting further and further away from those characters. And while you are staying with them, you're zooming out to take in something larger that's true about love and time and loss and all that. And I don't think of another form that can do that in quite that way.
I think you're right, excepting one thing. I think abstract music can do it too. Think of a Mahler symphony, and you have the solo violin playing and this intimate thing, and then this incredible large sound that is not to be believed comes from the whole orchestra, and there you are looking in the grandest manner, and the other way, the most intimate. One of the reasons that I wrote my first symphony, which is about my friends who died of AIDS, is because I visited the Quilt in Washington. And one of the incredible things is the idea of the intimate and the enormous, because every time you're walking down this tiny path, and to the left and right, in front and back of you, there are these quilts that were made by people who love the person who died and have all sorts of intimate and personal things to say. So you're looking at that, and then your head turns, and you see a sea of this going as far as the eye can see. And all of a sudden, it's so enormous to think all of these are these individual tales. And yes, opera's the best. I think symphonic music also has the ability to do that magical thing of becoming single and intimate, and then suddenly opening up to this grand panorama of what that's all about.
Well, that's the thing, because opera can be symphonic,
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
it's actually even worth noting that even in the first symphony, the third movement, were all of those elegies that
Mhm.
Bill said, and then you took the words away. So in many ways, certainly the way you practice it and the way I like to practice it, that opera. Unlike, say, in previous eras where you had, Rossini and there are any number of terrific pieces that do not really use the orchestra as a symphonic narrator, the way that it began to happen more obviously with Wagner and more afterwards. But that's, if you think of opera as a symphonic form as well as a dramatic form,
Right.
that's the whole challenge, to make it. To have the orchestra absolutely at full strength, and the drama at full strength, and the singers at full strength. If you do it correctly, everybody is working at 110%, and your head explodes. So if heads explode, our jobs have been done.
On the subject of heads exploding, where do you begin with this process? What does your process look like when you're beginning a work? This work in particular has a very interesting origin story, but where do you begin?
Well, this is kind of a tricky question. I mean, I'm John's second collaborator who's been in the room, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, so with, certainly you should talk a little bit about, I guess, about the build process with the ghosts. I had a leg up actually with John insofar as I'd known his music before I knew him. And of course, we've shared a life for over a quarter of a century, and I knew his sensibility and his process before, the idea of this show happened. I mean, for me, the idea of the show was Dracula had been suggested to me, and so I'll tell that story after this story. But once I finally figured out how a kind of Dracula hybrid could really hold the stage, I thought this score has John all over it. No one will be able to do this the way he does, because I knew the way that he worked. And so when in putting the libretto together for the first time, I didn't need, for example, to make sure that the language had a certain heightened or near surreal quality, because I knew that that's what he had responded to, as you know, from the Dylan Thomas story, which is quite rich and quite poetic. And just the heat and the intensity and the room for the kind of orchestral surrealism that he does, and a certain sense of having two musical narratives audible, both as themselves, even if they're happening at the same time. But you should talk about the ghosts.
Well, it's not just about ghosts. The thing is, Mark and I work in the same way, even though he started doing that before he knew me, and I started doing that obviously before I knew him. But most composers don't. There are these great forms that movements have: sonata form, rondos, minuets, scherzos, variations, and they all balance things. It's all about balances of opposites, loud, soft, high, low. And in the big scheme of things, how to build a piece of music when you don't use those is the real challenge of our time, because composers, they don't use the old forms, but a lot of them don't use any forms. They simply write and write until the piece is done, and they start where they left off, and they never think about the whole thing until the whole thing is done. And I've never liked that. And I have always wanted to plan the architecture of the piece before I write the piece, not discover it later after when it's half finished, but actually plan it. And so I've been doing that and teaching my students at Juilliard to do that, because I think if you throw away the traditional forms to do this very well, fine. But then what are you going to do in its place? So I do that. And I outline and draw and type and use colored pencils any way I can to build the architecture. And so Mark, on his own, was doing that sort of thing too. And I really don't know of anybody else I can name that did that the way I do it so exactly. So when we were writing this piece, it wasn't really so much of a problem, because Mark, in a sense, was building the architecture with the libretto. And he would talk to me about it, and he would have the arias and have this and that and offset opposites and build tension in a scene for 15 minutes and do all of those big shapes, because that's the way he works. So when I got it, my job was to merely fill in the dots.
Not that exactly.
I mean, he had, but in this case, his shape was the shape of the piece. And going against it would be silly. It was perfectly wonderful. If we had any adjustments, we talked about it on one or two little things.
Right at the beginning, you said, can the rule of three, because there are three questions in the libretto. It's like, can that punctuation be a little stronger? Done. I mean, it is true. When I started writing Little Women, and I was so terrified that of the, that there were so many ways to get it wrong, so that I started to break out an architecture more or less based on acting beats rather than the way John had done it with strictly music. But it was a way of trying to get the piece, to figure out, what is the piece about to begin with? Why are we doing this? Why are we here? Why is this better than silence, number one? And then how is that going to tell a story through time that isn't just the libretto of the opera, and isn't, just like a tone poem in which the libretto is, trailing off the back of the speedboat of the symphonic form. So that's how I had done the three or four operas actually before Lord of Cries happened. So at that point, it was here's the structure while it's 3 or 4 pages, and I could write it. I knew he could read it. And that's when that was already refined. And by the time we talked a little bit about what the sort of music that Dionysus would sound like in this form as opposed to that form. And so even as a lyricist, I was shaping the language, not to music that had been written, but to the kind of music that I knew that he would need, and so when it was getting more savage, I was pulling more from Euripides. And when it was in the Victorian mode, it was a bit more tailored and strophic and rhymed. So the language itself kind of gave you the costuming of the character, if you will, the actual shape of the libretto gave the character an attitude to act and gave him something to score. Right. So that's how that worked.
On the subject of the score, how do you go about creating these different sound worlds for Dionysus in form as Dracula for the different atmospheric moments of the piece?
Well, in 1979, because it was released in 1980, I wrote music for a film of Ken Russell's, who was this British director that was wildly excessive. He also knew symphonic music better than I do. I mean, he was amazing. And he was directing a piece called Altered States, which was about someone in these deprivation capsules and traveling back to primal states. I mean, it was a perfect movie because what I did was I had any orchestra I wanted, any additional instruments because it's Hollywood, and I could do anything I wanted because Ken Russell said, I want this to be wild. He had gone to hear a performance of my clarinet concerto, I guess just 2 days before he asked me to come in Los Angeles. And he heard so much in it that he wanted that Warner Brothers called and flew me out first class with a limo and everything. And it was wonderful. And he showed me and he said, this is the music I'm using. So they do things called temp tracks, temporary tracks, and they put them in. And because Ken really didn't know quite the kind of music that can be written today, but he did know a lot about the early 20th century, he put in some of these wild musics. He put in Bartok's from the Miraculous Mandarin, this wild dance. And when the Hinchi and Indians danced to that, it was to that tempo, and they danced to it, and I was supposed to replace it. Or he would put Stravinsky in, like parts of The Rite of Spring and other things, to get this primal feeling. And I had to actually go to the executive producer. I'm trying to remember his name.
Irwin?
No, not him. No, he's horrible. No, this is a great guy. And I said, look, in those days, you can't do an electronic mock-up the way you do now. The first time he heard it was in front of the full orchestra. Mm-hmm. So, and then he could decide if he didn't want it, not to do it. Mm-hmm. So I said, look, I'm looking for creating more primal sounds that I don't think Ken is aware of. But I think the Stravinsky and Bartok stuff has been used in so many grade B horror movies that actually doesn't do the trick. It makes people think it's a horror movie of the B mm-hmm. category. Mm-hmm. Can I do this? And he said, I'll back you up on this. Executive producer. So I said, okay. And I wrote it. And luckily, Ken loved it. And what I did was explore all the ways instruments can sound not like instruments, but other things. For example, an oboe, oboe is played with 2 reeds and you put your lips on it, you make a beautiful sound. When I was in Morocco, I heard Moroccan oboes, which were like our early shawms, in which they didn't do that. They put their lips over the reed, where the reed was inside the mouth, and blew their cheeks out. called embouchure. They had no embouchure. The sound is wild. It vibrates. It has microtones. It has all kinds of weird sounds. It's very loud, and it's very primitive. I learned that the flute could play below its range if it blows into it like a trumpet and sound a seventh below and sound like an ancient horn of some kind that has, you can't even determine what it is. I learned techniques of activity, of ways of making notes scramble within a range to get this wild cluster of sound. And all of that I did learning on Altered States. And it was really interesting because Altered States was written right in the middle of when I was writing a flute concerto for James Galway and Los Angeles Philharmonic called the Pied Piper. And right at the cadenza time, I had to write Altered States and just cease on that. So what happened is, then I had all these great sounds and ways of making sounds, and now I'm writing the rest of the concerto, and I come back and I say, well, I can use those in my piece. And so I absorb the language into my language. So it still could be tonal and lyrical, but then when it's wild, it could be extremely wild. And that's, I think, a great thing, just to enlarge vocabulary. And I've encouraged my students to enlarge their vocabulary, not to stay with what can be written by a staff, treble and bass clef and 12 notes. What else can you do? So I did learn that, and I did use it through my life. The ghost music is very much in debt to that. And of course, this piece is perfect for the primal wildness that I did in 1979. And so I felt very happy about that. And I think Mark knew that because he knows my pieces that have that in it, because they're later pieces. I said, I'm just going to draw in. It's wonderful how films can influence concert music and vice versa. In this case, I took from a film all the techniques I learned to do for the film, and I then was able to do it in my concert music, and it changed me as a composer.
I mean, you see why this clearly had him written all over it. And when you consider that John generally does one of anything, I mean, there are 3 symphonies, but technically there is one for full orchestra, one for band, and one for strings. At one point, I think it was the premiere of the Second Symphony in New York, it was a performance of the clarinet concerto, and someone raised a glass and said, "To the second Corigliano clarinet concerto," and Kitty piped up and said, "To the second Corigliano anything." Right, because yes, he's just one and done generally. Well, so the idea that this is John's second opera, in and of itself, is this kind of miracle. But I mean, it's so different. Him. It is completely different piece.
Completely different than the Ghost.
But that's yes, but it shares that range between the kind of lyricism,
and surrealism, and all of that. But it's a very different piece.
Yes,
which is why I wanted to do it.
Although it is your second opera, which ends with a beheaded soprano, and you can't. If you do a third, no, I'm not writing it. I'm not writing it. We're not. That's it. Once, twice. Anyway.
On this subject of subject matter, you both obviously read across a wide spectrum of genres with much enthusiasm and engagement. What strikes you? Is there a difference between the way you read as a reader, just as a personal occupation or passion, and the way you read as composers and Mark as a librettist?
Yeah, I mean, my personal choice in reading when I'm not working on music is historical novels set in places that fascinate me, like ancient Rome or something like that are accurate and yet deal with plots and all sorts of things happening. I don't think of them as operas in any way, because I'm very interested in plot and language, but it's not a poetic writing, the kind of poetic writing that you would need to be able to write an opera. But I enjoy that a great deal, and it's kind of the other side, away from work kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I bury myself in these adventures and learn so much about the times, about Alexander's time in Greece. I mean, they're fascinating things in the culture and the sophisticated way they live and the things they'd accomplished is fascinating. So that's a never-ending source for me. of fascination. And I do love that. But it's not an opera, no.
I tend to, I have a greater appetite for sort of richer prose than John does. If prose gets above a certain calorie content, he tends to not be terribly patient with it. Whereas, the opening page of The Mysteries of Pittsburgh, which was really just an aria in and of itself. I mean, it's the sort of thing that it is so richly musical that you don't want to set it to music, because how could you improve on it? Those are I think that Michael Chabon is the Fitzgerald of our time, frankly. But I'll read like Angela Carter, who was similarly Baroque as a writer, or Zadie Smith, both as a novelist and as a critic, who I think she's come to that quite late. She's brilliant. She's a really amazing critic. I'll read a lot of nonfiction. Mary Beard. Carter also did some beautiful nonfiction. I think the latest poetry that I took with us, of course, it was on a cruise to Greece 2 years ago, so there was that, but there was Robert Fagels's adaptation of the Odyssey, which I just was heaven, But I guess actually in terms of the language of opera texts, I'm a little more patient with plainer language than John is, only because I think I've come to sung text from the Hammerstein, Sondheim, through Lin-Manuel Miranda theater lyric, which can often be quite plain spoken. Think of, oh, what a beautiful morning, oh, what a beautiful day. Nothing is going on in the language. But it has enough room for music that a place where the music can actually transform it. And I remember actually I was writing Meg's principal aria from Little Women called Things Change in the piano that was then a couple of rooms away. And I played it for John, for notes. And he had made a one or two notes about changing the rhythm with the phrase rather than the bar line, which is one of those notes that I have kept with me for the next 20 years of composing. But that was really all he had to say. And I kind of said, if you have any criticism of it, this is the moment, because it's very early on. And he said, I could no more do this show than I could, walk on the ceiling. I mean, because it's such a plain spun story. So that, to that extent, we're kind of opposite sides of the coin.
Well, I can see all those things in musical theater, in musicals. I can see that, but an operatic voice singing "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning" might not be the best solution for me.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I think that's more of a problem to solve than two exclusive categories.
I haven't solved it.
It's not a criticism, but Alfred Drake, who was the first Curly Joe in Oklahoma, that was an opera baritone. He sang Kismet. It was a voice. I mean, because in that period, theater singers did train more as opera singers than. And Ezio Pinza was the first. Some Enchanted Evening. Helen Traubel was, although there's actually a funny story about the opera singer in the musical theater, because Helen Traubel was a great Wagnerian when she, I forget the character's name in Carousel, Nettie Fowler, I believe. But she was singing June is Busting Out All Over, big rollicking number. But she was singing it with sort of opera diction at the time. And Sondheim remembers, Stephen Sondheim as a kid, was hearing it in previews. And he thought that he was hearing Julie's busting out all over. And in the plot, she had just been announced as being pregnant. And he thought, surely they have not written Julie's busting, not in a Rodgers and Hammerstein show, but it was just Helen Traubel applying, Wagner vowels to a Hammerstein lyric. So there's that.
There's that
risk. Right?
I almost like thinking about what problems have been solved. Have there been insights into the text that have emerged as you worked through Lord of Cries? Have you come to different understandings of the characters or the narrative as the opera has continued its progress?
Well, for me, I have to say, once when Bill Hoffman, God love him, who hovers over this show, once I started mentioning to Bill what my frustrations were with Dracula, I thought, there seems to be some hold that this character and this narrative still has over us. But if you look at all the adaptations, they all seem to be played cards. I mean, the novel seems to be, playing on fears of, the sexually assertive woman or the sexually unusual man or the foreigner or whomever. And we're not concerned with these things anymore. And yet there does seem to be something in the anxiety of the human characters about something that partakes of sexuality but is larger than it. And Bill said, so you're writing the Bacchae. That's really, I mean, that, which is the one major Euripides that I had not read. I mean, to come back to your question about reading earlier, I've always read theater. I mean, there's a period when I would go to my public library and simply go through the theater section almost alphabetically, and we could take out like 12 books at the time, and I would just take out 12 play scripts, take them out for 2 weeks. I mean, it was just that obsessive. But somehow I had missed the Bacchae, and then I read the play and thought, oh, this makes sense. And then I went back to the novel, and I thought, surely Stoker, who was classically trained and was an assistant to Henry Irving, who was a classical actor, you almost think he must have known the Euripides, because I learned that there were so many points of overlap in the novel that I had missed. I mean, the fact that the MacGuffin of the novel is Dracula laying claim.
What the MacGuffin is.
The MacGuffin is sort of the false plot. It's a Hitchcock term, the false plot that leads you to the real plot. So the false plot of The King and I is, will Anna get her house, or does she have to live in the palace? And the real plot is, how are they going to fall in love and change each other? You know, so the MacGuffin of this is Count Dracula has claim to property in London, and it's Carfax Abbey, this religious building, and yet he, as a character, it has so much to do with Dionysus. So there are so many things in going through it. The fact that Dracula casts no reflection suddenly made a great deal of sense, because he himself is a reflection of the human characters. So of course, if he is, the face of the character is sent back to them, well, of course he wouldn't be visible in a mirror, because he himself is a reflection. So that's where the more I dug into the libretto, that's what I learned about the Stoker. And then John, what was your?
Well, obviously I got the libretto with all this put into it. Mm-hmm. Things like the three characters of Dionysus were interesting to me, of how Mark set them and how I would react to them. At the very opening, he is Dionysus, and later in the opera, he is Dionysus. But as the stranger, he's a completely different person and personality. He says he works for the master, but he's not the master, but of course, he's Dionysus. And then when he's seducing Lucy, he comes as a wolf prince. And one of the reasons for that is, for me, that I loved when he mentioned it, was because I wrote a piece called Circus Maximus for large concert band, all surrounding the audience. It's a big piece about our time and the Roman Empire colliding. And in it, when we got to the night music part 1, which is the night music of peace, of the prairie and all of that, I tried out with the French horns, drawing the shape of a wolf howl and asking them to do that without breaking. And it's hard, half valving and trying it. Because I got a French horn player into my studio and I taped him, and we tried it out, and finally we did it. So finally I got them able to do really beautiful wolf howls, which were in this piece. And of course here, they are absolutely fantastic when they come in this surrealist world where things are not what they are, and Lucy is wanting so much to join that, and she can't. And from the distance, these howls come, ululating women, all sorts of nice, wonderful sounds. But these are things I learned, and as I said, this script sort of told me that, because if anything wasn't clear, I spoke to Mark about it. But basically, I understood that, and I understood the three kinds of Dionysus figures and the kind of worlds they would be in.
Well, and to go into the libretto, I thought he'll do brilliant wolf music here. I've already heard it. So the privileges of long acquaintance, chapter 35.
Were there any unusual challenges or any spaces where you found inspiration beyond the text in other atmospheric worlds or media?
Well, one of the things that I found that gave me a kind of harmonic world, because this whole world, you have to. Today we live in different worlds with different pieces and different parts of pieces. And you need a world to be in, like the world of the ghosts, which I had to compose before I composed the ghosts actually singing. What was their world? And one of the great things about the Bacchae is the fact that its name actually indicates certain pitches. We all know Bach. Bach did that a lot. B-A-C-H. So in German notation, B is actually the note B flat. A is A, C is C, and H is B natural. And of course, the Bacchae only has another letter, the E. So B flat, so the Bacchae chord from the bottom to the top is B flat up to A, C, a repetition of C, B natural, A, and E, which gives me a sonority, widespread, and a chord when they're close together. So all of a sudden I had a harmonic world, which I found very useful because you have to limit yourself when you're writing. And when there are no limits, it's really hard to do. You have to find something in the piece that gives you a limit. Because I could be tonal, I could be non-tonal, I could be 12 tonal, I could be aleatoric, I could be this, I could be that. All of those things I've used. What is this piece cry out for? So I had actually given to me by the title, the name Bacchae, I had notes, pitches that I could then begin to work with. And they are through the whole piece. They will be coming out in various ways. So that was a great help to me.
See, for me, I actually had the opposite problem. We have so many adaptations of vampire lore, starting with Dracula and then going through Twilight and God knows what. And sometimes they can just be rather Baroque or fancy or softcore pornography, and none of those were what this piece was. So there was a way in which I had to go back strictly to the Euripides and then see what parts of the Stoker could belong and which parts really should be left on the cutting room floor. So there's no garlic, there's no crucifix, there's not a drop of blood. I don't think the word vampire is not uttered at all in this thing. So it's really like 95% Euripides, and the 19th century-ness of the Stoker is really used as a decoder ring. It's really used just to make the dynamics of the Euripides play clearer to a modern audience. But the other, it's not exactly atmospherics, but the thing that makes this piece seem almost depressingly contemporary to me, is the notion that Freud's idea of the return of the repressed keeps playing out over and over and over again in our contemporary world. Penthus has not gone away. The notion that if you cannot look at parts of yourself that, you perhaps wish were not there, but are there. If you can't make sense of them and you deny them and you pretend that they can be wished away, they will turn monstrous and they will destroy you and they will take other people down with you. And Euripides got there first. And it's one of the reasons why I quite self-consciously restored the Euripides ending to this opera, because the Stoker ending is not entirely, the Stoker ending is a wish fulfillment. The Stoker ending is we kill the vampire and the vampire stays in the coffin and we all go back. Although it's quite interesting that at the end of the novel, a lot of people forget this, that the characters say, when we go back over all of our records, all there are diary entries and memories, and there's not really a single first-hand shard of evidence to prove that we didn't make all this up. It's the one indication that Stoker gives that maybe it's a projection, whereas Euripides is quite square about it. You don't tell the truth about this and it will come back and destroy you. This is every time, you read a story of, the attorney general in New York who's shutting down all the prostitution rings, except the one that he goes to, or, the lawmaker in the Midwest who is, lobbying for anti-gay legislation by day and visiting, the male lover in the crack den by night. And it's funny if it's not you. It's funny if you just feel like, of course, this is a problem. But it seemed to me in looking at the piece, because, you always have to ask the question, why do we need anything of Dracula now? Why do we need anything of the Bacchae now? Why, and Bill's, observation always is that a classic doesn't age. That's what makes it the classic. And I thought if you're going to ask why quite apart from the delight of finding sort of Euripides at the bottom of the Dracula pond, and the fact that knowing that in just collaborating with John, that musically he'd absolutely get the sound of it. I, as a playwright, had to ask the question, why do we need this play? Why is this a play in 2021 that speaks to us? And, regrettably, all you need to do is open a newspaper to realize that the concerns have not aged. So that's one of the things that both of us are really trying to get to try to understand what makes people with whom we don't necessarily agree, what makes them tick, how to hear them, how to bring that problem onto a stage so that we can, as ever, make of the theater a safe place to talk about dangerous things.
Yes. Yes, I mean, the thought of and I think especially in this time when we haven't had that space in which we get to, I mean, I find myself constantly processing the ways in which I'm looking for that connection, that release, like on the thought sort of repression and release, like that can be found in the audiences of a theater, any of the theatrical spaces. So thinking about all these now is especially exciting. Just one final question as we come up on this the return to theatrical spaces. Are there any particular sense experiences or rituals that are a part of going to the theater that you're especially excited to experience one more time when we return? John?
The excitement of going to the theater. I mean, I can't wait to actually see other people sitting and me, and then something happening on a stage that is affecting everybody, because you really feel an audience.
Mm-hmm.
I know as a composer, when I sit in the audience, I know if they're excited, enthralled, bored. I know everything, and I learn a lot. And I tell my students, you must sit in the audience, you must listen to the audience, even though you can't hear them speak to you, they will tell you. And so it's that communal response to something exciting happening on stage that is what it's all about. And so we are looking forward to that. I'm sure everybody's looking forward to that. And I'm hoping that in the fall, everything opens up and everything is back, including the great orchestras and opera houses in the world, because it's amazing that this world has gone through what it did.
Mm.
And now we've got to come back.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. I mean, it's because a large theater, particularly, a concert hall or an opera house, it's one of the few spaces that we go to as a community to experience something in real time as a community. And particularly in the opera house, we have not only the ability, but really kind of the brief to talk about the deepest things that we can think about. I don't think that, as organized religion declines, I think there was a poll I just read that fewer than half of Americans identify with any religious tradition, whatsoever. And as most of us spend way too much time in these little online silos, in which we're not, I mean, social media is actually something of an oxymoron, because what is less social than looking at the screen and typing? I mean, it's just, there's so much that is missed, when you are not face to face, when you're not picking up all the nonverbal cues, all of what it is to, to be in a room, with other humans, and the opportunity that we have as artists making the art that we make is the opportunity to make of this disparate group of strangers who may never see each other ever again, for that one set, for those few hours, to make a community where you might not have had one before. If you're responding to a character with whom, that you may have met an avatar of which in real life, and to whom you have, or in whom you have no interest, but you see what John has done, what I have tried to do, and get that character limbed, from the inside, and you feel for him or her in a way that you didn't before. It's an emotional and a social and a political act. I mean, there's a way in which what we do can not only celebrate community, but can be part of creating it. That has always been my attraction to cities, to art, to any group of, to any crowd. I mean, years ago, I used to say that my idea of a city day is to take the train, and then you're on a crowded sidewalk, and you run into a friend, and you go into a crowded cafe, and you catch up for half an hour, and then you go into your rehearsal with 30, the whole thing. It's all about the group, and the group and art. And, when you consider particularly that this amphitheater in Santa Fe is as close to the sort of Greek amphitheater in which the Bacchae would have been performed. Mm-hmm. I mean, on the same trip that I read the Fegel's Odyssey, we actually saw the theater at Epidaurus where so many of those plays were staged, and I all but wept. It just felt so, like you were just so connected to the reason for what we do, and you had that experience when Circus Maximus, it's actually, I didn't think of this before, but Circus Maximus, which is bouncing off of those Roman rituals of entertainment. I mean, the subtext of that symphony is really, the virtues and terrors of mass entertainment. And there was one performance of this that was done in Taormina in Sicily, which was one of the oldest Roman amphitheaters still extant. And to hear that piece performed in the kind of theater that was really its subject. You've actually had a lot of that lately, because the last time we heard The Ghost of Versailles was in the theater at Versailles, in which it was set. And that DVD is coming on the month, right? Mm-hmm. So we're doing a lot of site-specific stuff. But yeah, that's why we're both so happy to come back to live theater, because in many ways it's our raison d'etre.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both so much for sharing so much of your time and your insights with us. I know that I speak for everyone when I say I'm going to have to remind myself to breathe until opening night. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
This has been wonderful. We're really, really grateful to you too, Jennifer. So have a wonderful day, and we'll do it again. Live and in person.
Can't wait.